Delmarva Today with Don Rush.
Incarceration of a loved one is hard on any family, but for children it can be especially painful and isolating. You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush. One effort to help them navigate those struggles is contained in a new edition of a book entitled Advice to Ninth Graders, Stories, Poetry, Art, and Other Wisdom. It's an anthology put together by the Pathfinder Club, or Paving a Trail of Hope, and Pops the Club, or Pain of the Prison System. And this afternoon we have Amy Friedman. She's editor and also founder of Pops the Club. Welcome to the program.
Thank you very much for having me.
So one of the startling statistics I run across is that 1 in 14 children either have or has had a parent behind bars. Tell me a little bit about that, because that's quite a striking figure.
It's quite a striking figure. And where that comes from is in 2016, the Annie Casey Foundation did one of the really first major longitudinal studies on children of the incarcerated. So, most of the understanding of that experience was missing, in part because there's so much stigma that attaches to these kids that it's a secret that kids keep, which is part of the issue. But it means that in every classroom, I don't care what school you're in, I don't care what community you're in, there are kids who have been impacted. Our organizations serve kids with parents who have been incarcerated and also other loved ones. So siblings, boyfriends, girlfriends, cousins, uncles, aunts. It's a profoundly impactful experience.
Now, one of the things that strikes me is that they are going through certainly an emotional turbulence. I mean, they're in their adolescence. They've got someone in a prison, and it must take an emotional toll on not only themselves in terms of connecting with those parents, but also their self-image alone.
Absolutely, exactly. You've nailed it. There are, one of the things that the studies that have since been done shows is that the adverse childhood experiences, the ACEs, that these kids experience is similar to kids who've lost a loved one to death. Big difference being that there is not the kind of support that a child with that kind of loss experiences. And so they're navigating this, and being a teenager, as we all remember, ain't easy. But being a teenager carrying that experience is especially difficult, and that's why we started doing the work we're doing.
The other thing that strikes me is that there is this stigma, which obviously leads to people trying to keep it secret. Stigma not only in the sense that your parent, for instance, may be incarcerated or be in trouble with the law, but there's this expectation that perhaps they too will wind up in prison.
I think that's one of those myths that travels around. Where my passion for this subject came from was 30 plus years ago. I was a newspaper columnist writing about prisons, fell in love with and married a man who was in prison, and raised 2 daughters whose father was in prison. And I experienced firsthand, first, the stigma of that attachment, and second, and maybe more profoundly, the stigma and what my daughters went through as a result of what their father had done and where he was. And one of the things that always struck me was whenever I would hear even well-meaning people, I remember being in a conference once with a bunch of social workers talking about these poor children of the incarcerated and how it was more likely that they would be incarcerated. And I tell you what, my hair was on fire, because it's just that statistically is not true. And it's a belief that, starts to be absorbed by the people who are hearing it about themselves.
No, the other thing that strikes me is that in addition to the stigma that may be associated with prisons, that this falls perhaps even harder on folks who are people of color, African Americans, Hispanic children, because you already have a whole set of myths about that community as well.
Right, and we so vastly disproportionately incarcerate people of color and people who are dealing with poverty. The proportionality is out of just crazy. I don't have specific numbers in front of me, so I don't want to make a mistake there. But we're crazy in this country. We lock people up willy-nilly, and we really do disproportionately target communities of color and poor communities.
By the way, in terms of your daughters, how did they navigate this? I mean, what lessons did you learn? How did they fare in all of this?
Well, my daughters, I used to wryly say, my daughters who are all grown up now, but I used to jokingly and wryly say that they became world-class liars. They developed these ways of hiding who they were and hiding their experience. And that experience included the challenge, which a lot of these kids endure, of going to prisons to visit, which if any of your listeners have visited people they love in prison, it is not easy. It is not comfortable. It's especially uncomfortable for kids. And so they were, in addition to going to see their father in this ugly little room where they, first had to put all their stuff away and had to like dress a certain way and had to hear guards commenting on them and, guards sort of saying, they couldn't believe that I would bring children into a prison, that kind of thing. That then they would have to go home and go to school and pretend they hadn't just gone through that. The impact for them was they really have struggled their whole lives with both physical and mental health issues, and self-esteem issues. I think that they had a really hard time believing anybody who told them how smart and gifted and fabulous they were. They just had this little song running through their head that told them that wasn't true. And it's what led me to want to do something for all these kids who are impacted that way.
How did those visits, or how did that connection affect their father? I mean, what was that like for him?
It's a great question. Mixed. It's one of the things that I know about people getting visits in prison is I think that there is this joy of seeing the person you love, but every time you have to say goodbye and those gates clang closed and you walk back into the jungle of prison. And so there were times, I recall times when he asked us not to come. It just was too hard on him. And then, then there's this sort of cycle that happens where we're trying to protect him, including my girls trying to protect their father from understanding that they were dealing with things around the stigma of his incarceration. So there's this wheel of shame and sorrow that happens.
One of the things, there are a number of poems and stories that are in the book itself. One of them is really sort of the loss of family altogether. I think it started by Crystal May Statler. Who talked about the shootings of both her mother and her brother. I mean, it's a very interesting pattern, by the way, in terms of poetry, but it says that brother and mother share the same nose, the same almond eyes, and almost the same autopsy. There's like this sense of loss that you get from this poem, especially as she pairs both her mother's loss and her brother's loss. Yeah,
that's a powerful poem. Yes. There's a lot of loss and sorrow involved in this experience and connection. I think that there's so many different stories and so many different angles of vision. There are also kids who sometimes lose that loved one because the other parent might not want them to stay connected, and yet they still love them and they still long for them. And so there's separations happening all over the place and connections. And And this book and other books we've done each year with the kids who are in this club are designed to help them express themselves, to talk about all that they're experiencing, and to experience a little bit of healing through that writing and art making. And also the other side of it is those of us who are putting these books out there, wanting people, since we incarcerate so many people, we should be hearing what the impact of that is, what the impact of it is, not just on those we're putting behind bars, but those who are staying at home. The Annie Casey Foundation study was called A Shared Sentence, which is very apt. It is a shared sentence.
And there is, I believe, it's by Bill Mendez Trujillo, What Do I See Day to Day in America? Of sharp condemnation, as it were. I think towards the end he writes, they want us to give up our humanity to them. They think we are disposable. They don't want to help us. It seems as if to capture that, not only the individual feeling about helplessness and the fact that a society is against you, but also a much broader condemnation of the country.
Absolutely. And boy, did you do a beautiful reading. You're finding all the lines that I really love. But yes, they say it better than I can say anything. So I just want everybody to hear their voices.
And there's this loss, too, of not only family to prison, but also to drugs. Kai Salazar, the lost parent, says something about first days long gone, and it talks about fingers being wrapped around needles instead of my hands. Dad, who was there every day, has now been turned into a memory. You find that to be the case with a lot of these children?
A lot of times people are incarcerated as a result of drug addictions, alcohol addictions, and so many of the kids, not all by any means, but many of them have grown up surrounded by addiction, and they're what's so beautiful and resilient about them is how they have endured so many losses and so many challenges, and yet here they are making art and making poetry and being in school and just trying to navigate everything else that a teenager has to navigate. So the book too is a celebration of them, of who they are.
Because in a number of the essays, for people giving advice to ninth graders, they talk about staying in school, talk about studying, even though that's pretty hard. I think it's a pain to motivation, I think. Tyler Stonebreaker says pain.
Yeah.
It's a deep feeling of hopelessness that can break you, but you got to use it as a motivation or it can eat you alive. This thing that you've got to keep on plowing ahead, even though it can be difficult.
Yes, and aren't they so smart? I mean, one of the reasons we did this particular book this time was so often I and other people who are running these clubs had heard these pearls of wisdom come out of kids' mouths offered to younger kids, and they do it on the page and they do it out loud, and I think too, a lot of times we don't listen to teenagers, but teenagers really do like to listen to each other. So that's the other impetus behind this book, because hearing it out of someone who's not too far away from who you are is sometimes easier to swallow and sometimes smarter.
The other thing that strikes me is that this obviously is this just the latest edition. Do you find over the years as you've been doing this that there have been any changes, anything that strikes you as a common theme amongst these various offerings?
Amongst the writing, I would say one of the common, there are a number of common themes, but one of the strongest is the sense of comfort and family that they feel inside the clubs themselves. Just real quick little story. The very first club we ever had, the very first day, the first two girls that walked in the room were both 10th graders, and they had been good friends since kindergarten, but the one secret they didn't know about each other was that they both had fathers inside. And they flew into each other's arms, and it was that moment that sort of made us realize how important it was for these kids to have a place in school where they could know they weren't alone and where they could say openly and honestly what their experiences were to each other and to share those. And so that common theme is this family that gets created.
Any changes over the years?
Changes. It's a really good question. Wow. I think that the sad part to me is that we founded POPs 11 years ago, and part of what the dream was that it wouldn't be needed, that we would stop incarcerating so many people, that there would be fewer kids impacted, and that has not changed.
We've been speaking about a new edition of a book entitled Advice to Ninth Graders, Stories, Poetry, Art, and Other Wisdom. It's an anthology that's put together by the Pathfinder Club, or Paving a Trail of Hope, and also Pops the Club, or Pain of the Prison System. And we've been talking with Amy Friedman, who is the editor and also a co-founder of Pops the Club. We appreciate you taking the time to talk with us this afternoon.
Appreciate so much you're having me. Thank you.
You're listening to Delmarva Today. This is Don Rush.
Delmarva Today with Don Rush.